out there, all you sensational scrub jays. Thanks for joining us for another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Sarah, and I'm so excited to be here with you all and joined once again by my sensational co-host, Casey. It's good to see you, Casey.
It's so good to see you too. It's been a little bit.
It's been a little bit. Yeah. We've been off having adventures and living life.
Yes, it is good to be back though. I definitely we've have you been getting your nature time in?
Not very well. I'm going to be honest. I have been all out of whack the past several weeks, really. So I'm hopeful that getting back on the ball with podcasting will also just sort of reignite my spark and get out there and reprioritize my life again here to bring some things that have been slipping back to the front.
I think that's a good way to put it. If you're just joining us for first episode, welcome. Sarah and I are environmental educators. We used to work together and started this podcast in 2021. We used to do it every single week.
We did for a long time.
For a long time. Then I had a baby and then and then I took off for a little bit, and even getting back into the swing of things has just been a little bit of challenging for both of our lives. We do this as a hobby. We are not experts, but we try and do research on all of our episodes and bring you guys topics that have to do with nature, conservation, sustainability, and chat about things that we can learn from it, and kind of the through lines and lessons that we can learn from all these different topics that we cover. So check out our backlog. There's probably something fun in there that interests you, because there's a lot of different things, because we've been here for like 3.5 years.
Crazy.
Crazy.
And Casey, I do have to mention before we get to the topic, if you've been a listener, I think the last episode that we put out was with Kat Morris, the sustainability
Yeah.
manager for the Chicago Marathon. And I do just have to say, I did get to meet her in Chicago.
Yes.
She's lovely. I met her as
No
well
surprise.
as Tina Muir, who we referenced in the episode. I got to meet her as well and fangirled a little bit over her. And we did go do all three of us did the plogging event that Tina hosted. And so we got to run around the city of Chicago together picking up trash. And it was just one of the best things that I've ever done. I loved it so much. So that I have not been getting in my nature time, but that really like fed my soul that day. So I just want to throw that out. If you are new, check that episode out. And I just had to follow up with those of you that did hear that episode, that we did successfully meet up. And just to, in case either of them happen to be listening, thank you to both of you for a wonderful event.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Kat, for being on our last
Yeah.
episode. Sometimes we interview people, and
Yeah.
these are smart people who do things that are big. So that was one of those that was exciting. Today we're going to be taking a little bit of a turn from that into kind of a local, not a local, not for me,
Local for
actually
me.
local to Sarah, recent-ish news story that kind of popped up on my social media feed. That's how I first learned about it. But I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on it because my husband had brought up some of the things that started to make this a little bit more of a unique case. Today, we're going to be talking about some shenanigans that were happening with the Florida state parks a couple months ago. So, Sarah, I want to start us with our icebreaker. Can you tell us about your favorite Florida state park?
I can. I will say, and this may come up in the course of our discussion as well, as far as I can remember, have only been to one Florida State Park.
I can't imagine there's a lot of local ones to you. Am I wrong?
I mean, it depends on how you define local. I do have
Okay.
one that is very local to me, and that is the one that I've been to. I have other green places in Florida that I like to visit and just haven't made the rounds to other state parks. But I have visited Lake Louisa State Park, and I don't know what to tell you about it. I really enjoy it because it's a good size for me, first of all. It has paved roads that you can drive on, but it's good for me also because I can run on those paved roads. It's got a lot of trails that you can wander. It does have lakes, as the name would suggest. So I've gone kayaking there before. They have a nature fest event that they put on every year, and I really like going to that because it's a great opportunity. You get guided tours by some of the park rangers, so you get to learn a lot more about the ecosystem and things that go on at the park and how they care for it. But they also have a lot of other folks come out and share information. They talked about the fire management that they use at the park. We've done like bird walks. So it's a nice place to go and you feel like you're out in nature, right? Like it's different than going to just a local park where you're walking around and it's pretty, but you can hear the street noise behind you the
Right.
whole time. So it's a nice place to go and sort of feel like you can get away and there's still things to do there as well.
I think that's going to tie in a little bit of
Yes.
like kind of how we approach state parks. So stick
Absolutely.
around and we're going to talk about some shenanigans with Florida state parks. All right, guys, we're back. I decided on the word shenanigans a while ago, and I think I'm just like stuck with it because I cannot think of anything else to call this.
We'll put a little tally mark up every time
Yes,
we hear the
I'm
word
gonna try and
shenanigans.
use synonyms, but we'll see what's going on there. So I decided on the subject back in September, and I wanted to cover it, and of course, life got in the way, but it recently felt like it became more relevant because we've done some news ones before, like we did when the East Palestine train derailment came
Hmm.
through or the Willow Project got approved. For me, doing those, I really wanted to like explore what I felt like the media wasn't necessarily like giving us all the picture in nuance because they often don't have like the time and space to do that about an individual story. This one I was mostly like I was like, okay, I think I got the grasp of it, but now I kind of feel like it's got some broader implications and like learning lessons that we can learn from it. So let's dive in a little bit. We're talking about Florida state parks. Little overview for you. Florida has 175 state parks. That's a lot of
I've
state
been to
parks, Sarah.
one.
And you've been to
I
one. I asked you if it's the only one local to you. Then I'm like, oh my gosh, there's actually quite a few of them.
Yeah,
So
I know I've looked up, I think at least two more that I feel like I need to get to. So,
yeah, and these state parks attract 30 million visitors a year. Florida has an award-winning state park program. I guess there's a national state park award, and you guys have won it like 4 times
I
fairly recently.
literally had no idea that that was the thing.
Yeah.
I gotta
So
get on the ball here.
I know Florida listeners get on out to these state parks. They brought up, of course, the economic impact of these state parks. It's $3.6 billion and it supports 50,000 jobs in Florida. So it is also a good reminder that nature, in a lot of ways, can be part of the economy in ways that we don't always think about it. And overall, outdoor recreation in Florida is huge, and outdoor recreation generates $52 billion in economic output and supports 460,000 jobs in 2022 alone, which is the last time that there was a number available for Florida. So, I mean, you guys are the sunshine state that already evoke within your guys' being. You want to be outside where it's
Hmm.
wonderful and warm all the time in Florida when there's not a hurricane out and it's not sunshiny. You've talked about Lake Louisa, and can you list again what activities you like to like what you like about doing there?
Well, I use it for running. I use it for just nature walks, birding. I have gone kayaking there, which was really fun. So those are kind of the things that I've done. They do also have equestrian trails. There's campgrounds and little cabins that you can stay at as well. I'm sure there's more, but that's what pops to the top of my mind.
Yeah, I think like you covered some of the important things. We parks are like an int I have a lot of thoughts about how we think about parks. And my sister actually does a lot of park development and restoration and creation in our local area. And I think she has some of these thoughts on it too, where the way we conceptualize parks kind of depends on what our aesthetic preferences are. So, like, if you think about your neighborhood park, for example, you most likely have a bunch of grass, at least like the park closest to me, bunch of grass, playground, soccer field, a lot of open space lined with trees on the outside, walkable, meant for kids, meant to walk your dog through. But as you like expand the scale of it and go from local parks more into things like county and state parks, I think you start to see this like intersection between more natural elements and then human use, and then you expand out into national parks, and then those ones are the ones that we definitely focus much more on the nature preservation, the historical preservation of things, and more of like the land as it is, maybe quote unquote, versus how we use the land. Does that feel like a fair assumption?
100%. And to some degree, it makes sense logically too,
Right.
right? National parks are going to be the largest. They are going to
Hmm.
have this wide range. I mean, so where have I been in the past year? The Smokies and the Rockies. And so the national parks are the ones that can cover that whole expanse.
Right.
And so the park is the attraction, right? You're going
That's a
to
great way of putting it.
see
Yeah.
that space. Your local park down the block is going to be contained within a block, usually. So,
Right.
and there's no cost. There's not, I mean, I guess some parks districts do have programs and things like that that you can get involved in, but you're not charging admission for these parks. They are, places for community and places to get outside, and there needs to be something for you to do.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's just like going out and playing in your backyard, basically, right? It's right there. You're seeing the same things. And these state parks are usually going to be a mix like in between those sizes. They're going to be a mix in between the distance that you have to travel to get there. And I think people are going to be looking for different things to do there. So, absolutely, part of it still is going to be that preservation of your local ecosystems, right? What makes up your state? You want that to be seen in your state parks. But even like I mentioned it, it's nice to go out to the state park and have something to do there, whether that was the festival that I mentioned or bird walks or whatever the case may be, kayaking. Yeah, so I think it definitely, and you also get to the money part of that, where those state parks are going to have a staff to care for the park and a staff to run the activities, and you need to get people there to help pay for that staff too. So yeah, I feel like it makes sense logically that you have to strike that balance within a state park. It was a lot of rambling to say that. I'm sorry.
No, yeah. I mean, like my local state parks, a lot of times we'll go there to do like kayaking, for example, which is like a recreation that interacts with nature. And you're
Mhm.
talking about like running, but running a lot on things like having paved paths that facilitate recreation, but also make the space more accessible to the general public rather
Sure.
than being like, please be free in these woods. So, yeah, it's the interaction between recreation and nature. And I was looking when I was researching this story. I wanted to know what the mission of the Park
Hmm.
Service was because I wanted to know like how within the bounds is what we're talking about for them. And the mission of the Florida State Park Service, according to them, is to provide resource-based recreation while preserving, interpreting, and restoring natural and cultural resources. The objective in park planning is to achieve an equitable balance between preserving natural resources and providing public access for outdoor recreation. Boom. Just like
Yeah.
what my perception is seems to be actually like what their stated mission goal is for Florida State Parks specifically. So, lots of state parks in your state, lots of economic benefits. The governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, in 2023 tried to do a lot of programs that incentivize using the state parks. Like I think he offered some discounted admissions.
Hmm.
Right when I was looking this up, we're right around Veterans Day. Veterans got free admission to state parks today. So there are programs that incentivize outdoor use. And as we've talked about in our first or second episode, nature interactions are super good for us as humans, just our mental health and physical health too. But back over the summer, something I have to kind of categorize it as nefarious started happening. And I want to kind of break into this with this is both something that I have a gut reaction as someone who enjoys a more naturalistic state park of not liking. So already like the proposal we're about to talk about is not necessarily something that I would have been friendly with in the first place. But I think what makes this story unique is that the process by which it went about seems like it was trying to sneak one under all of the Florida residents, to try and get one past you guys. Shenanigans, pull the wool over your eyes to try and get this go forward. So let's talk about it. So there's a guy named James Gaddis. He is our point of origin for this story. He worked for the Department of Environmental Protection in Florida as a senior planner and cartographer, which is like a map maker. And in August, he and other staff members, he reported, received instructions to start drawing maps for development plans for several of Florida's state parks. They were instructed basically that this project that they were put on is now taking precedence over basically everything else that they might have been working on at the time. I don't know if that was outright said or just insinuated that it was coming straight from the governor's office, which, according to a lot of local news sources that are all sorted cited in the link in the show notes, Governor DeSantis is extremely involved in all arms of his government. Like, he doesn't like for there to be a lot of independent action that he's not at least aware of, if not involved in. So it tracked with a lot of the local news sources that Governor DeSantis at least knew about the project, if not, as Gaddis suggests, was behind the project, that this project is going to take precedence over everything else, and that they weren't supposed to talk about it, not just with like the public, but also other people in their building. So this struck him as weird, first of all. But he got to work on the project, starting to draw out maps for some development projects. And Sarah, if you scroll down a little bit, I've linked a list from the Audubon Society. It has a list of what ended up being in those projects. So would you mind opening that up and letting us know some of the things that you see?
Yeah, so Casey's already shared more than I was ever aware of about all of how this went down, which we'll kind of get into more as we talk through it. But yeah, my understanding was that this plan involved nine of
Hmm.
Florida's state parks, and the idea was to add a bunch of lodging and different recreational things to some of these parks, but not so much recreation like the things that I was mentioning at Lake Louisa. Some of the biggest things that got the most attention were golf courses. So, in particular, the one at the top of this list here is Jonathan Dickinson State Park, and the plans included adding a couple of golf courses, an 18-hole and 9-hole golf course. This says in the Atlantic Ridge Scrub community east of the Bright Line Rail Track, encompassing roughly 550 acres, as well as an 18-hole golf course in the Atlantic Scrub west of the Bright Line Rail Track, encompassing roughly 500 acres. So, a couple of big golf courses in that state park. There's also another state park, a couple of them that had plans included building a 350 room lodge. We're looking at things like pickleball courts and disc golf courses and things of that nature in some of the other parks.
I was surprised at the number of pickleball court proposals.
Pickleball is huge
I
right
know
now.
it's huge, but it's
This
literally
is
eight of the nine parks have proposals for pickleball courts.
this
And
is
I just find
pickleball's
that
15
so
minutes of
funny.
fame.
We are, I mean, like my our garden center sells ornaments with a bunch of different sports on it. And like 2 years ago, pickleball sold out immediately. It's very strange to me because I'm just not in that community. I know it's hot, but like
I have zero interest.
the idea, no, it's not for me necessarily either, but the idea that like it's so big that eight of the nine state parks that have proposals on them have additions of pickleball courses. There's also disc golf courses, so if
Hmm.
you've ever used like the frisbees hit
Yep.
in the chain situation, but definitely the golf courses got a really big response, and so did the two lodges, one in Anastasia State Park and one in Topsail Hill Preserve, because they weren't just like additional cabins, they were full scale,
Right.
like 350 room hotel-ish sort of deals. And that's not unheard of. Like, I think Turkey Run or Shade State Park in Indiana, they've got like a lodge where you can stay. You mentioned cabins at Lake Louisa.
Hmm.
Like it's not unusual to have some sort of place to stay over, but definitely like when you start to think of the scale of those things, you can feel the impact that that could possibly have on the environment. Golf courses for sure are the one that I think really struck a chord with everyone. According to NPR, Florida has somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 public golf courses, with a third of the rounds played by tourists from out of state. That's a lot of golf courses.
Yeah, we don't need any more.
Coming from a Florida resident. Very good.
Who admittedly does
Not a
not
golf
play
player.
golf.
I was Googling just like a quick, like, let me see if I can hit some of the points of how dreadful golf courses are. And really, like, one of the first articles that popped up was a Rutgers University article about how golf courses have the opportunity to be a net benefit for the environment. Diving more into that, it seemed to be more of an ad for their program to help like superintendents of golf courses train to be better environmental stewards. I don't think this article was like, you know what would be better than your state park's natural landscape?
Golf course.
A golf course. I think it was a little bit more
No.
like, you don't have to poison the environment with your golf course. There are better ways.
Yeah, I don't think there can be any. I mean, we've talked about lawns, how just
Yeah.
regular lawns are bad for the environment, and what is the golf course if not a giant,
A lawn of
meticulously
various heights.
manicured lawn of various heights? Yeah. So outside of the destruction of the natural habitat that perhaps would be there if you're building it in a state park, the water use is a really big
Yeah.
one. I know we've talked about that before. Yeah, is there a better way to do golf courses? I'm sure, because the way that we currently do them
It's awful.
is not beneficial in any way.
Yeah, it's rough. I mean, like, so the Audubon Society has some sort of third party, I mean, them being the third party certification process for golf courses to be a more bird friendly habitat. And I can see where you could utilize like features of the landscape where they'll leave like a cluster of trees or
Yeah,
whatever and add birdhouses, reduce pesticide use, reduce fertilizer use. All of these things are good to improve current golf courses, but there's not really an environmental argument for golf courses being added to especially a state park. One of the things that the Audubon Society really points out is the impact. Obviously, they're a bird heavy organization. One of the birds that would be impacted potentially by some of these projects is the Florida scrub jay. Sarah, have you ever seen one? Do you know what they look
I
like?
know what they look like, but I've never seen one, and I'm really mad about it because I have gone looking for them, just not successfully yet. I saw a Western scrub jay when I was in Colorado, I think,
They,
which they
there's
actually look fairly similar. They're just bigger, I think, than the Florida scrub
If they're like blue jays, then they're obnoxious, but they are some cutie patootie little birds.
jays.
Like they're very pretty. They are threatened with habitat loss. Also Florida has insane bird migrations that
Hmm.
are available for birders, so it's a really great place to be a birder, is Florida.
Yes.
So the idea of disrupting habitat near those places with specifically activities that are not necessarily environmentally friendly. Some of the arguments made by the state as a pushback is that these areas were like underutilized is a word that they really like to be using there. And I can't speak to the merits of that, obviously. If there are studies that show that people aren't using that area or it's already disturbed. Like I don't think that I'm not wholly against any development on state parks.
Correct. Yeah, I was just about to say, like, if this is the place to talk about that, then yeah, I want to jump in there too, because
Yeah.
like some of these things that are on this list, I don't like a disc golf course, but I actually don't know much about disc golf courses. My brother plays disc golf, but I've never been like, I don't know how intensely those areas are manicured in comparison to like a golf course. Um,
My experience, it is not a huge, like there's like basically maybe
there's
a little concrete pad poured
right
for the
for
beginning and
the
the end.
yeah.
In fact, I think they're doing some further development on our disc golf course because it was so underdeveloped that it's like a little bit of a hazard to be using. So like there is an accessibility element where you have to make sure that you are creating pathways between places and making sure that there aren't
Right.
hazards that are going to injure people.
Right. So stuff like that, I don't necessarily have a huge problem with.
Yeah.
Pickleball courts again, like, I mean, how big, where, those kinds of things.
Right.
Cabins, because you do have to get people to the parks. And if
Right.
I'm sitting here as a person who enjoys nature time and has parks within a drivable distance, and granted, I live by myself. Maybe if I had other people here, like maybe we would be like, oh yeah, let's go to the park. And it's just not a thing that I like want to go out and explore necessarily by myself when I have
Hmm.
other places that I already know I like to go. So there's things there, but still, I'm sitting here as a person who enjoys nature, enjoys getting out in nature, and professes an interest in these things. And I have still only been to one state
Sure.
park in my time here. I understand a desire to try to increase traffic to these places. And if you feel like, nature in and of itself is not necessarily going to be the draw for everybody. And so how do we give them that draw and still protect the nature is what
Right.
we're looking at here. And I don't feel like multiple golf courses and giant hotels are finding that balance. Extra camping sites, a pickleball court for those who choose to partake in such things. I don't know how many people a pickleball court is going to get out there either, but I'm just saying, like, I don't hate everything that was on this
I
list.
agree. Yeah.
I hate some of the things that were on this list and some of the ways that it came to light, which I know we're going to talk about more.
Yeah, the state parks, let's talk a little bit about what the normal process is on this. The state parks are owned by the state and therefore theoretically owned by the people, by our tax dollars. They are meant for people to utilize and have natural spaces that kind of belong to everyone or recreation spaces that belong to everyone. And so when you're doing development projects like this, typically what you have is first you kind of take public input and then you get together a plan based on that public input. A lot of times, if it's anything like there's a state hospital near me that's getting developed into housing, they're redoing one of our local parks. All of that starts with like surveys in our area of what people want to see, and then they kind of present that data alongside, in my experience, what the next plan is to try and convince people that like, hey, this is actually what you want, even when it doesn't feel always like what you want. And then you have meetings with public comment on them. And theoretically, the people who are making the decisions are supposed to take the public comment under advisement. You might have people from the community who are impacted. Like when I've gone to these meetings, they've asked where I live to make sure that like I'm a relevant voice, not some rando from like if someone from Montana was coming here and being like, you shouldn't build this
Right.
350, they'd be like, that's, I mean, thank you, but that's not who this isn't for you. And I'm sure Montana has amazing state parks. So there's like a whole process. Even in my little local park, we had part of it burned down recently, and so they want to do some renovations on it. I just took a survey that they're going to open for 6 full months. It's like a very extensive process, and that's not really what was going on here. And this is where I feel like you breed distrust in the process that anyone's necessarily working in good faith. And that's because they started working on this project and announced within the staff, not actually to the public yet, that they were going to have public meetings. But those public meetings were going to all occur for all these 9 projects simultaneously
Mhm.
during a work day, like not in the evening, like a lot of these
Yeah.
meetings are, like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there would be no virtual component. So, like, if you were not able to physically get to the meeting, there would be basically no record of you having any sort of input. According to Gaddis, and this is one of the articles in the show notes, he said he was supposed to host one of the meetings for public input. Gaddis said he was instructed to play a pre-recorded PowerPoint, answer no questions, limit capacity to about 100 people, and stop the meeting after an hour.
At least this is the first time that I'm hearing about that part of it too. So my experience with all of this was just that basically I saw people posting about Florida not needing any more golf courses. And that's not what our parks was for. And so that's where when I stopped and looked it up and I saw that these meetings were all scheduled for the same day and everybody was mad about it and everybody was so mad about it that they did end up adjusting that plan, which we'll talk about it. But yeah, that extra piece of information about this is how we're going to run those meetings does not feel great to hear about. Doesn't feel great that they were all scheduled at the same time. My only thought is outside of it being just lousy, is that maybe they thought people wouldn't care. Like maybe they just legitimately thought that people would think that this was not a big deal. They were wrong. If
They
that's what they thought.
I have a little bit of evidence that suggests that they know that people would care very much so. But yes, people definitely cared. So Gaddis basically said that he was actually a little bit worried for his personal safety having to conduct these meetings because he knew that they would be wildly unpopular as he would, and I don't want to mischaracterize anything he's saying because I only have the limited amount of information that like is filtered through these news articles, and also like trying to reconstruct this
Right.
timeline a couple months out was a little harder than I was expecting it to be. But basically like he was making these plans and he said he felt disgusted and was like, "Oh, all right, like there's something wrong going on here." And according to the Audubon Society, this whole planning session was out of sync with proposals that exist to improve state parks. I guess there's like a cycle of proposal seasons like we're talking about here where they have the public comment and stuff that the Audubon Society is involved in knowing what's going on and that kind of stuff. That's part of their mission is to be able to preserve this natural habitat and know what's going on. They were like, this wasn't part of that process. This was very much like shoehorned in. So I'm missing an important date in here. I'm going to guesstimate around when it was. I believe it was August 19th is when Gaddis decided that he was going to contact the media and leak the information that he had to try and get some attention for what felt like was trying to be snuck in versus a normal comment period. And the next day, the DEP released the schedule for these meetings. Like they decided they weren't like, oh, let's pause this. This isn't ready. They were like, no, we're going to hold the meetings and they're going to be in 8 days. So really compressed timeline. Again, no planning period. And I will say, like, at the time I went to a planning meeting, I didn't feel like I got a lot of notice on it, but I wasn't 9 state parks worth of stuff. And so they decided to plan these. And that's when Florida resident they were going to revolt is how I would characterize that.
It was everywhere. I was in another headspace at the moment. I was sort of peak marathon training, but it was everyone was posting about it.
Everyone I know who lives in Florida, not everyone, most of the people I know who live in Florida, who, to be fair, are connected through like environmental education and a lot of things. So this is already in their wheelhouse, but they were posting articles and memes and all sorts of different awareness things to try and get people to these meetings. Conservation groups tried to mobilize everyone on their mailing list to write letters, to submit emails, to give comments to their representatives, making it clear that this sort of development was not in the interests of the Florida residents and a lot of the causes they support. So things like Florida Wildlife Federation, the Audubon Society, Vote Water, which I think is a clean water organization. There are a lot of different organizations that came in, as well as just individual people who I would bet don't identify as conservationists themselves, who were like, heck no, this is not what we
Yeah.
want. So this backlash was so big that first the DEP put a pause on the meetings in general because they said they needed to locate facilities that would better house the amount of people. So remember in the original thing, Gaddis said that he only wanted like 100 people
Hmm.
in there. Clearly, there was going to be so many
Yeah.
more people. They decided to push it off. In the meantime of that happening, both of Florida's senators, and if you're like have this gut feeling that this is a partisan issue, it's not. It was across the aisle rejected on both sides. Both of Florida's senators are Republicans. Both of them, Rubio and Scott, came out against this proposal. A lot of state representatives and like, hey, politicians are always going to try and toe the line that like they feel is most popular, and often environmental issues are winning ones. So when they saw that everybody was mad about it, they were like, me too.
And as it should be, honestly. Like
Absolutely. Yeah,
you're supposed to be speaking for the people, so
exactly. Representation for sure. So the meetings eventually got canceled. And the governor said they were going to go back to the drawing board. The governor himself got pretty immense backlash on it. He now is sort of characterizing it as some sort of like left-wing media skew, but it honestly seems like it's just like a no, everybody hated your bad idea and the sneaky way to go about it. And he called the plan half-baked, not ready for prime time. So he definitely like tried to distance himself from the project, but according to a lot of the inside sources, the likelihood that he was directly linked to this project is pretty high because he's a very involved governor. So the project got pulled. So this year, basically, there is no risk of golf courses being put directly on state parks. Now, Sarah, you did mention that like perhaps they thought people wouldn't notice or wouldn't care or maybe even liked this idea. However, in 2011, famed golfer Jack Nicklaus was going to work with the state on a similar proposal where they were going to put golf courses that he designed and like you're having a well-liked celebrity name behind
Hmm.
it on the state land. And everybody rejected it back then. So this didn't seem to be something that was coming up as sort of like an organic, again, like I have an idea and turns out nobody likes it. It feels like it was more like I have an idea and I know nobody's gonna like it. So what if I were to try and push it through in a way that would be the most the least likely to be noticed by the people who are definitely going to be upset about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that. I also can see that, oh, that was 13 years ago. Am I mathing that
Yeah, you're
right?
mathing correctly.
13 years ago, and maybe in this grand scheme of things with all of this other stuff, like possibly that, or also just possibly like thinking that maybe people were more apathetic to the
Yeah, or
state
like
parks at this point, you know? Like,
or in that time period, even just like the elected officials in Florida have become more Republican, which is just more associated with prioritizing more of the on like a broad scale, not saying all Republicans are this way, but just like representative wise, often lean more towards development versus the environmental preservation element of it. So yeah, maybe.
well, I was just gonna say too, and again, please, I'm not like
Yeah,
how this all went down,
bad.
bad.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not trying to defend. I'm just trying to think like
Are you believing the
again.
best in people? Are
No, 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 no.
you
I'm not even.
okay?
I'm not even thinking about that. I'm not even thinking about like the people involved per se at all. I am just trying to think, is there also a solution? I don't know enough about funding for state parks either, where it all comes from, but I do still think that there could be,
An economic argument for making the parks viable.
yes. And again, I'm not saying that this was the right one.
Right.
I do not think that this was the right one. But I think perhaps there is an argument to be made there for somebody thinking that. Again, to me, you have to find a balance there of the economic value and the preserving nature component that this very clearly did not hit.
Right.
But I don't just like what we were saying earlier is that I don't think you can't ever say, hey, I want to add this thing to a state park to
Right.
give people another recreation option. I think that those things can exist, but you need to go about it in a open and what is the word that I'm looking for?
Democratic? I
Yes,
don't know.
maybe. But go through the appropriate
Yeah.
processes to do so.
Yeah, I mean like the pie in the sky ideal of like having beautifully preserved nature is one kind of a myth anyway, like the idea of the wild as it is. It all of this really implies no human interference and disconnects people in general. It often like takes out the role of indigenous people historically. It takes out just like we are nature too. So how do
Mhm.
we interact with it? And you're right, like we also just don't live in that world anyway. We need to make sure that this is a viable thing that like adds value even for people who don't necessarily think nature in itself is the only valuable thing. And also, like, some of this development would give more people access, not even just like, oh, make more people want to come out. Like,
Sure.
people who are struggling from like chronic illness and things, being able to like spend having a home base to rest in a lodge
Right.
or something where camping's not an option. It's just definitely, like we said, this didn't feel very democratic. As far as the funding part of it, so this was dubbed the Great Outdoors Initiative, which is interesting because like that was the name of the last plan too,
Yes.
which the last plan, which was about like discounting state parks to make them more accessible to people, I think was very popular.
Yes, it was. And was a
Yeah.
little bit of a source of confusion for me when I first started seeing the other stuff come
Yeah.
up.
So it's interesting that like the 2023 version was like, how do we get more people out to state parks? I know how we'll do it. We'll discount admission. We'll make it like, accessible to people. And then the 2024 version is how do we get people to come out to state parks? What if we built a golf course? Historically a very like accessible thing for people to
Oh
come like
gosh. Yeah.
that also in itself almost felt a little deceptive of like this is a plan that seems so different from the last thing that hiding it under the moniker of the last popular thing.
Yep. Agree.
Yeah. So it's things like that. It's the compressed timeline that
Yes.
is also out of sync with the normal procedures. It's the fact that Gaddis says that he wasn't even supposed to talk to other people in the building about what was going on.
Yeah.
It's the compressed meetings and like inaccessibility of that. All of these things would really lend itself to say like this was an intentional move to undermine a democratic process to just let people decide what's going on in state parks. We don't necessarily know how it was going to be funded. I guess one of the partners for the project was an organization affiliated with like remembering the Tuskegee Airmen. So I guess like one of these golf courses, I think, was going to have some historical education, memorial sort of things for Tuskegee Airmen. I kind of like I hate that they had to tie like that was going to be their tie-in, and they've pulled out since. They're like, yeah,
Yes.
no, we don't want anything to do
Yeah.
with that. But like, it has a very like kind of cloaking this environmental destruction. This is a very negative way of looking at it, but cloaking an environmental destruction in the guise of something that's like a progressive move. The positive way of looking at it is like, isn't it great that we can remember this important contribution from the African American community to society, and how could we do that in a way that people wouldn't necessarily normally encounter that information? But to me, it's hard not to look at everything in this as nefarious just based on the way they went about it. You just like breed distrust. How are we supposed to assume you have good intentions or think that this is actually the best thing in the people's interest if you're not acting with their consideration in mind? So let's talk a little bit about the fallout from this. James Gaddis got fired. He was fired for behavior unbecoming of a civil servant or whatever and leaking this information, confidential information. A GoFundMe was set up for him. He's got lots of money coming into that. He's trying to figure out if he doesn't end up needing the money because he finds another job quickly, how he wants to distribute that money to environmental causes. He's also retaining a lawyer to potentially see if there were any sort of like whistleblower protections that were violated by his firing in response to this instance, because there are certain workplace protections you have if you try and out bad behavior. They aren't supposed to be able to retaliate. I have no comment on whether that's seems like a viable path or not. That's just what he's doing right now. The head of the DEP in Florida, whose last name is Hamilton, and he had been part of the DEP for a long time. Like he has a lot of history in civil service for environmental area of environmental policy. He is stepping down. When you read the articles, it basically says this isn't explicitly linked to the state park issue, but it is the state park issue is mentioned in every single one of those articles. So it is at least like the freshest thing in everyone's mind about what's going on with the state parks. He is being replaced by a woman who doesn't seem to have any background in environmental policy at all. So sometimes you think like, okay, well, if this guy who was in charge of the DEP when this bad thing was happening is removed, good things have to follow. But it seems like that perhaps in this instance, it's someone who's this person has like a their family has been in politics for a really long time. They've been working in this administration for a really long time. So it seems more of a like political appointment rather than valuing expertise. So there's not always like a, ah, we beat a bad guy and now a good guy will come in.
No, and
Does
I
that make
think
sense?
that's I yeah,
That's
I
very reductionist, but like I feel
yeah,
like that's
I feel like that
sometimes a
would be it.
reaction.
Yeah.
You know, that's the fairy tale ending is, and then we don't have to do this anymore.
I I feel like that would be an oversimplification anyway. Like
Yes,
people are going to have differences in opinion in what even that means. But yeah, this doesn't feel like the ideal appointment in a to have a person with no environmental experience in the head of your environmental department.
right.
But who knows? Hopefully, she will have learned from this. And as you were saying at the beginning, there are things that we, the people, can learn from this as well in how to move forward from here.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to today. We are not like an overtly we're not a partisan podcast, but the environment is political. A lot of the issues surrounding environmental protection, environmental justice, environmental equity is all things that are impacted by environmental policy. And we just had a national election, and the candidate who won has a pretty bad record, definitely when it comes to climate change, but on a number of fronts when it comes to the environment. And so when I was first looking at this episode, I was like, okay, cool. Well, we'll just like, cover what happened, but I wasn't really sure how to wrap it up. But after the election, I was like, oh, I know how to wrap it up. We're going to talk about what we can learn from this. And I think the first thing to learn is that this is not new stuff going on. It's not the first time that trying to sneak one past everybody has happened on a political level on any subject. And it won't be the last time it is. With politics having so much crossover with special interests linked to money, like more of these political appointments will potentially go to people connected to donors versus like people with genuine expertise in their subject matter. And so I think sometimes when you're an average citizen, you want to just trust whoever's in charge to know what they're talking about and to have your best interests in mind. That is the most comfortable way to be a citizen, but I think that we need to be realistic that that's not necessarily something that we should expect every time out of every appointment. And so if there's an issue you care about, this is something that you want to pay closer attention to. We also learned from this particular instance that anti-democratic moves against the environment are not very popular with anyone.
Woo woo.
Woo! Like that, I think that's like the really positive thing about this is
Yeah.
we the people won
Yeah,
this one.
absolutely. I was so again, I like missed the boat here. I didn't get super involved in this, but I was so proud of everyone
Yeah.
that did. Like I just it truly made me happy to see how many people spoke out about this and stepped out and came together over something that they felt really strongly about. So, yeah, I felt really good about that.
Yeah, there's an artist whose art was used on some of the protest signs. Her name's Veronica Steiner. And she said, quote, I don't think that this is like a red or blue issue. I think anybody that lives and has been raised in Florida should care about the land, and that should be politics aside. Everyone should try and protect their natural resources, period. And I think that that's, again, no matter what state you're in, no matter who got elected, that's
Yep.
the way we should be looking at what your personal values are. I think like anytime you vote, you're not going to find someone who agrees with you 100% on every single issue. It's your job to communicate where you disagree with that
Hmm.
person. Your voice doesn't end with voting. And number three is being organized and loud can absolutely work. It's not always going to work, but this is a moment that it did. And a lot of the credit, obviously, to Gaddis for informing the public of what was going on. But immediately, organizations that exist for a variety of purposes were able to mobilize their members and people who care about those issues to be able to make action. And I think that for me is really useful because I'm tired all the time from just life and being a mom and Like I get burnt out on the news and I don't always know the best political channels to tune into to know what's going on. Like even in my community, our city website is bad. It's hard to find meetings and things on it. It's easier to follow their Facebook page, for example. But organizations like the Audubon Society and these other organizations are there to email you to be like, hey, there's an issue that you
Mhm.
probably care about because you care about the things we care about, and this is the time, and this is how you can effectively act. And so there's so much less homework when someone can tell you what to do, and then you can actually just do it instead of having to be like, okay, what's happening? And from the start, you always do your own research. You can always, figure out what nuances are important to you. You don't have to agree with everything that the organization that you're in touch with does, but they can at least be a good pathway for information. And that's like the main things I learned from the shenanigans number three, Florida state
Yeah.
parks.
That was great. Thank you so much, Casey. I think that was a really great recap. Like I said, you gave me some pieces of information that I hadn't been aware of previously. But and then those were three really good points to wrap it up with. And I am really proud of this as a bipartisan environmental success story in the past few months. So thanks for
Yeah,
putting all that together.
absolutely. Stick around. We will be back with the challenge of the episode. All right, we are back. If you are new to the pod, every time we do an episode, it used to be every week, challenge of the week, but every time we do an episode, we issue a challenge related to that episode that we encourage people to not just learn, but take action. And this doesn't have to happen this week, but try and do something related to the challenge. And you can always let us know what you decide to do. For me, what made me feel out of this, the action to take, is to find your people. I think this is a good time, no matter if you're happy or sad about or indifferent about the election results, your voice matters, and you can find political and non-political organizations to be a part of that focus on the issues that you care about. So I think that that's a really good shortcut to being involved and making an impact when that can't be your entire job because you live a normal person's life. So things like the Audubon Society, they have local chapters around. They're just an example. I'm not particularly advocating for them, but like they're an example of an organization that's national that has local chapters that you can be part of. In this case, it was Vote Water. Whatever is important to you, climate
Yeah.
change, environmental protection, doesn't have to be environmental. It can be whatever you feel most strongly about. You should find those people and you should subscribe to their mailing list because that to me is like the easiest way to digest some of this stuff.
Yeah, or find your cause might even be another way to
Yeah,
state the same thing. But yeah, so if you are passionate about your state parks, or if you're feeling
yeah.
more like you should be now, look at, there's usually like a Friends of the State Park organization that you
Hmm.
can get behind that will keep you involved. So think about what it is that you care about and you're passionate about. Is that water? Is that clean air? Is that endangered species? Is that your parks?
Right.
Is that your, whatever it is, and find a group,
Type
find
in
an
your
organization.
state
Yeah.
and your cause and organization, and something will pop up.
Yeah. And I'm issuing myself a personal challenge to visit at least one additional Florida State Park
Yes.
before the end of the year. I'm going to give myself to the end of the year to do it.
That's fair. Yeah.
That's throwing that in there for me to explore the state a little more.
Yeah, I definitely think that like this is a get your nature time. It's important to take care of yourself. Find your people. I find it easier for me when I get my weekly email blasts when it's not always feeling like an emergency. So finding
Yeah.
these people before there's an emergency to me is more comforting because I feel like I have good context of what the organization's doing and what the general updates are on things that they do. So that definitely felt empowering to me. So I am really appreciative of everybody who's listened to the end of the episode. Sarah, if they have any input for us, what can they do with that?
You can find us on the internet. You can find us on Facebook, A Little Greener Podcast, or you can send us an email at a little greener podcast at gmail.com. Still working on the Instagram thing. And by working on, I mean,
I mean, we're aware of it.
someday
So
we'll fix it.
we will.
But yes, you can contact us on Facebook or email, and we are always happy to hear from you.
All right. Thanks, guys, for listening. We hope you have a great week.
Bye.